The sun burned hot over the wide desert land. Dry winds carried dust across the empty plains, and the sky stretched endlessly, pale and cloudless. Luke, a cowboy with a weathered face and calm eyes, rode slowly on his horse. He had been searching all morning for 2 strayed cattle from his small herd. The desert was quiet except for the sound of his horse's hooves on the hard ground and the occasional cry of a hawk circling high above. His canteen rattled softly against the saddle, half empty from long hours of riding. As Luke guided his horse toward a dried riverbed, he noticed something unusual. Near a cluster of rocks, a small figure was slumped on the ground. At first he thought it might be a bundle of rags or perhaps an abandoned coat, but then the figure moved weakly. His heart jumped. Someone was there. He urged his horse forward and quickly dismounted. It was a girl, no older than 10 or 11. Her dark hair was tangled and her face was pale with exhaustion. Her lips were cracked, and her eyes opened only halfway, heavy with weakness. She wore a simple dress worn at the edges, and her bare feet were dusty and cut from walking across the harsh ground. She looked at Luke with a mix of fear and pleading, too weak even to speak. Luke felt a rush of concern. He knelt beside her and gently tilted his canteen to her lips. The girl drank greedily, the water spilling down her chin, but her eyes grew a little brighter. Luke reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a piece of bread he had saved from breakfast. The girl took it with trembling hands and bit into it hungrily. "You poor thing," Luke murmured softly, though he knew she might not understand his words. "Where's your family? What are you doing out here all alone?" The girl said nothing, still too weak, but she clutched the bread close as if it were a treasure. Luke looked around, wondering if someone had abandoned her or if she had wandered off and gotten lost. He was about to lift her into his arms and take her to the horse when he heard the sound of footsteps behind him. He turned quickly, his hand moving instinctively toward the revolver at his side. From behind a cluster of mesquite bushes, a woman stepped out. She walked with quiet strength, her back straight, her long braids falling over her shoulders. Her face carried the beauty of age and endurance, her eyes sharp yet tired. She was clearly Apache, dressed in traditional clothes made from deerskin, decorated with careful stitching. She held no weapon, but her presence was strong, commanding. Luke froze for a moment, unsure of her intention. He kept his hand near his revolver, but did not draw it. The woman's gaze moved from him to the girl at his side. A wave of relief crossed her face as she hurried forward. "My daughter," she said softly, her voice low but steady. She knelt beside the girl, touching her cheek and checking her hands. The girl looked up at her mother with weak joy and whispered something in Apache that Luke did not understand. The woman then turned her eyes on Luke. They were dark, deep, and unreadable. Luke stood quietly, sensing something important was happening. He opened his mouth to explain himself, but before he could, the woman spoke again. Her words were careful, as if she were choosing them with great weight. "You fed my daughter," she said slowly, her English clear though accented. She placed her hand gently on the girl's head. "By the tradition of my people, now I belong to you." Luke blinked, startled. He had expected gratitude, maybe even anger for touching her child, but not this. He frowned, shaking his head. "I don't understand," he said honestly. The woman's gaze did not waver. "Among my ancestors," she explained, "to give food and water to a child is to save her life. To save her life is to bind her family to you. I am her mother. I owe you my life. I belong to you now." Luke felt the ground shift beneath his feet. The desert wind whistled softly through the dry branches nearby, and the girl continued to nibble her bread, unaware of the weight of the words spoken. He looked at the woman, seeing not only her strength but also her deep sincerity. She was not joking, nor did she speak lightly. "I think you're mistaken," Luke said carefully, trying to remain respectful. "I don't own people. I only gave her water and bread. Anyone would have done the same." The woman shook her head firmly. "No, not anyone. Many would have ridden past. But you did not. You gave from your hand, and now your path and mine are tied together. This is the way of my ancestors, and I cannot turn from it." Luke felt trapped between her words and his own conscience. He had no desire to claim ownership over anyone, yet he saw that to her this was no small matter. She was bound by something older and deeper than he could easily dismiss. The woman studied him again, and this time her eyes softened slightly. "My name is Ayana," she said. "This is my daughter, Leia. You may not wish this bond, but it is here. I will walk with you, serve with you, and protect your life because you saved hers." Luke sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. He looked at Leia, still clutching her bread and leaning against her mother. Fragile but safe for now. He could not turn them away, not when they had nowhere else to go. "All right," he said finally, though he still felt uneasy. "You can come with me. I'll give you shelter, some food until you're both strong again. But not because you belong to me, because it's the right thing to do." Ayanna tilted her head slightly as if listening to his words but holding to her own truth. She nodded once, her expression calm, almost regal. "You may call it what you wish," she said. "I call it tradition. Either way, I will not leave your side." With that, Luke helped them both to his horse. He lifted Leia gently, seating her before him while Ayanna walked beside them. The cowboy guided his horse slowly across the land, the shadows growing longer as the sun dipped lower. The desert wind cooled, carrying the scent of sagebrush and dust. Luke tried to quiet the storm of thoughts in his mind. He had set out to find lost cattle, but instead, he had found something that might change his life forever. He had fed a hungry child, and now, by ancient words he barely understood, her mother had claimed to belong to him. As they moved toward his small ranch, Luke glanced at Ayanna walking proudly beside the horse. Her steps were steady, her chin high, her eyes focused on the horizon. There was no sign of fear in her, only certainty. He wondered what strange road lay ahead for them, bound by bread, water, and an old tradition that would not let go. The ride back to Luke's ranch was long but quiet. The sun had begun to set, painting the sky with streaks of orange and purple. Leia leaned against Luke's chest, her small body tired but comforted by the steady rhythm of the horse's steps. Ayanna walked beside them, never stumbling, her pace strong even though she had clearly endured days of hardship. Luke kept glancing at her, still unsettled by her words earlier. He did not understand the weight of her tradition, but he could not deny her resolve. When they finally reached the ranch, the shadows had grown deep. Luke's place was simple, an old wooden cabin, a barn with a creaking roof, a small corral for his cattle. It wasn't much, but it was all he had built with his own 2 hands. He dismounted and carefully lifted Leia down, setting her on the ground. Ayanna's eyes scanned the land, her gaze sharp and curious, as though she was measuring every detail of his home. "You'll both be safe here," Luke said quietly, opening the cabin door. "It's not grand, but it will keep out the wind." Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of leather and wood smoke. There was a table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed in one corner, and shelves stacked with supplies. Luke set a lantern on the table, lighting it to chase away the dimness. Ayanna helped her daughter sit on a small stool, brushing the girl's hair with gentle fingers. Leia looked stronger already with food and water in her belly, though her eyes still drooped with sleep. Luke prepared more food, beans heated over the fire and a little salted meat. He divided it, giving the largest portion to Leia. Ayanna nodded once in acknowledgement but said little. She ate quietly, her movements graceful, her expression calm. Luke felt awkward at first, unsure what to say. He wasn't used to company, and certainly not to the company of a proud Apache woman and her daughter. After the meal, Luke spread a blanket on the floor near the hearth. "You both can sleep here tonight. It'll be warmer by the fire." Ayanna glanced at the bed, then at him, and for a moment Luke thought she might refuse, but she only placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder and guided her to the blanket. Leia lay down quickly, drifting into sleep as soon as her head touched the fabric. Ayanna sat beside her, her dark eyes watching Luke closely. "You live alone," she said at last. Luke nodded. "Yes, just me and the cattle. My folks passed years ago, never married. Guess I got used to the quiet." Ayanna tilted her head. "Quiet can be heavy, sometimes heavier than noise." Her words struck him more deeply than he expected. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the lantern flame. "Maybe you're right." The cabin fell silent again, except for the crackling of the fire. Luke found himself stealing glances at Ayanna. She was not like the women he had known in town, dressed in frills and speaking with nervous laughter. She sat tall, her back straight, her eyes calm but full of strength. He felt a strange mix of respect and unease around her. The days that followed brought change. Ayanna did not sit idly as a guest. Each morning she rose early, tending the fire and preparing simple meals. She fetched water from the well, swept the cabin floor, and even mended Luke's worn shirts with neat stitches. When she worked, she did so without complaint, as though every task had meaning. Luke protested at first. "You don't have to do all this." "I told you, you're not beholden to me." Ayanna's gaze was steady. "I do this because it is right. Because you saved my daughter. My hands must repay the gift. There was no arguing with her. Luke soon stopped trying, though he still struggled with the idea that she believed herself bound to him. The ranch began to feel different with their presence. Leia's laughter echoed across the yard as she played with the chickens, or followed Luke to watch him work with the cattle. Ayanna sang soft songs in her language while she worked, her voice carrying like a gentle breeze. For the first time in years, Luke's cabin felt less like a shelter for one man and more like a home filled with life. But not everyone welcomed the change. Word spread quickly in town that Luke was sheltering an Apache woman and her child. When he went into town for supplies, he felt the weight of suspicious stares. Men muttered as he passed and women pulled their children close. At the general store, one rancher sneered. "Didn't know you'd turned your place into a reservation, Luke," the man said loudly. "You think it's wise keeping her there? Folks don't take kindly to that." Luke's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He gathered his supplies and left, though anger simmered inside him. When he returned home, Ayanna noticed the shadow on his face. "They spoke against me," she said simply. Luke looked at her in surprise. "How'd you know?" Ayanna shrugged. "I know how men look when they fear what they don't understand. Their eyes told me." Luke wanted to reassure her, but he realized she needed no reassurance. She had endured much worse than whispers and stares. Still, he hated the thought of anyone treating her and Leia as less than human. As days turned to weeks, Ayanna began to share pieces of her world. At night by the fire, she told Luke about the tradition that had bound her to him. Her people believed that to give food to a starving child was to give life itself, and when one gave life, the bond was unbreakable. The family owed their loyalty, their service, and their protection to the giver. Luke listened carefully. "I don't see it that way. To me, I just did what anyone should have done." "Perhaps," Ayanna said softly, "but our ways are older than your ways. I cannot break them even if I wished. My heart would not let me." Her honesty stirred something in Luke. He began to see that her bond was not about chains or ownership, but about honor. She believed in it with all her soul. To dismiss it would be to dismiss everything she was. One evening, a storm rolled in, rattling the windows and shaking the roof. The cattle grew restless, and Luke hurried to the barn to secure them. To his surprise, Ayanna was already there, calming the animals with steady words in her language. Her presence seemed to ease even the nervous herd. "You know cattle?" Luke asked, impressed. "I know life," Ayanna answered. "Whether it has 2 legs or 4, it listens when the voice is steady." Luke laughed softly, shaking his head. "You've got a way about you. Never seen anyone handle them like that." Her lips curved into the smallest smile. "Perhaps you will learn from me." The storm passed, but the memory of her calm voice lingered in Luke's mind long after. By now, Leia's health had returned. She ran across the yard with a stick in hand, pretending it was a horse, her laughter filling the air. She clung to Luke often, showing him the little treasures she found, pretty stones, feathers, wildflowers. One evening, she climbed onto his knee by the fire, her eyes shining. "Papa Luke," she said suddenly, the words innocent but full of meaning. Luke froze, his heart thudding. Ayanna looked up sharply, her eyes meeting his. For a moment, silence hung heavy. Then Luke smiled gently, patting the girl's hair. "That's a fine name, but only if your mother approves." Ayanna's gaze softened, though she said nothing. She simply looked at Luke with a quiet intensity, as though weighing what kind of man he truly was. Luke knew then that something was changing, not just in the bond forced upon him by tradition, but in his own heart. He no longer saw Ayanna and Leia as strangers bound to him by accident. They were becoming part of his life, filling the emptiness he had carried for so long. The weeks passed and the land began to change with the season. The air grew warmer, the days stretched long, and the grass in the pastures turned a softer green. Luke had grown used to the sound of laughter and voices around his ranch, sounds that once seemed foreign to him. Where silence had once been his only companion, now there was life, Ayanna humming as she worked, Leia's playful chatter as she chased chickens, the creak of the old gate as it swung with their movements. Luke sometimes caught himself stopping in the middle of a chore just to listen, realizing how much the quiet solitude he once valued had turned into a heavy weight he had not even recognized until it was lifted. But outside the ranch, trouble was stirring. Small raids had begun near the edge of the territory. Cattle stolen, barns set on fire, travelers ambushed on lonely trails. Many settlers blamed native tribes immediately, their fear and prejudice mixing into anger. Luke knew well that fear could spark flames faster than truth. Every time he rode into town, he heard whispers grow louder. Men at the saloon spoke of forming groups to deal with the threat. Some looked at Luke as though he was guilty by association, because of the woman and child living under his roof. One afternoon, when Luke was tying supplies to his horse outside the general store, a rancher stepped forward and blocked his path. His name was Clay, a broad man with rough hands and a sharp tongue. "You'd better think twice about who you're letting into your place, Luke," Clay said, his voice loud enough for others to hear. "There's been trouble, and folks say it's them and their kind behind it. And there you are, feeding one and giving her a bed." Luke straightened, his jaw tightening. "Her name is Ayanna. She and her daughter had nothing to do with the raids." "You don't know what you're talking about," Clay smirked. "Maybe not. But when a snake slithers into your house, you don't wait to see if it bites. You throw it out." Luke's hand curled into a fist, but he forced himself to stay calm. He could feel the eyes of the townsfolk on him, waiting to see how he'd react. He shook his head. "If you're calling her a snake, then you're blind. She's done more honest work in a day than you've done in a month. I won't hear another word against her." The rancher muttered under his breath and turned away, but the tension lingered. Luke knew that defending Ayanna in public had earned him enemies. Back at the ranch, he tried to hide his frustration, but Ayanna sensed it anyway. She always seemed to know when the weight on his shoulders grew heavier. That evening, after Leia had gone to bed, she sat by the fire across from him. The glow of the flames lit her calm face. "They doubt me," she said quietly. "They see me as danger." Luke looked at her, surprised at how plainly she spoke it. "They don't know you," he said. "If they saw how you care for Leia, how you've helped here, they'd see the truth." Ayanna shook her head gently. "They do not want to see. Fear is easier than truth." Her words rang in his mind long after she fell silent. The next challenge came when trouble reached closer to home. One night, Luke was awakened by the restless lowing of cattle in the corral. He grabbed his lantern and rifle, rushing outside. The moonlight revealed shadows moving near the herd. At least 3 men, masked and armed, were trying to drive off his cattle. Luke raised his rifle and shouted, "Leave those animals or you'll regret it." The raiders fired a shot into the air, scattering the herd. Luke ducked behind the fence, his heart pounding. Before he could make his next move, Ayanna appeared at his side. She carried no gun, but her eyes were sharp and steady. "You can't fight them head on," she whispered. "They are more, but I know the land. Follow me." She led him quickly around the edge of the corral, moving like a shadow. Her knowledge of the desert was unmatched. She knew where the ground dipped, where the brush was thick enough to hide them. They circled behind the raiders, who were too busy with the cattle to notice. Ayanna bent low and showed Luke how to set a snare using rope and a fence post. With quick hands, she made a trap that tightened as soon as one raider stepped into it. The man fell with a cry, tangled in the rope, and Luke fired a warning shot into the air. The other raiders panicked, grabbing their fallen comrade and fleeing into the darkness. When it was over, the cattle slowly settled, their nervous sounds fading. Luke turned to Ayanna, astonished. "How did you know to do that?" Ayanna's face was calm, though her breathing was heavy. "My people have lived on this land for generations. We learned to use what is around us. I could not let them take from you, not after what you gave us." Luke lowered his rifle, still shaken. "You didn't just help me. You saved the herd. Without you, I would have lost half of them tonight." Ayanna's eyes met his, steady and unwavering. "I told you, my life is tied to yours. I will protect what is yours as if it were mine." In that moment, Luke saw her differently, not as someone bound to him by words of tradition, but as a partner who had chosen to stand by him when danger came. The days after the raid carried a new sense of closeness. Luke worked with renewed energy, and Ayanna's presence beside him no longer felt like a burden but a strength. She helped mend fences, tended to the cattle, and even taught Luke how to read signs of the land: tracks, broken branches, shifts in the wind. He realized she saw the world in ways he never had, noticing details he would have missed. Leia, too, grew more attached to him. She followed him everywhere, asking questions about the cattle, the tools, even his horse. One afternoon, she proudly announced that she wanted to be a cowboy like Papa Luke. Luke laughed, lifting her into the saddle and letting her hold the reins while the horse walked slowly. Ayanna watched from a distance, her expression unreadable, but her eyes softened when Leia's laughter rang out across the yard. Yet Luke knew the challenges were not over. Townsfolk still whispered, trouble still loomed. But with Ayanna and Leia by his side, he felt a strength he hadn't known before. He no longer carried his burdens alone. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the sky red, Luke stood outside the cabin with Ayanna. The land stretched quiet around them, peaceful after long days of work. He turned to her, his voice low. "You don't owe me, Ayanna. Not because of bread, not because of water. You've already given more back than I ever gave." Ayanna's eyes lingered on the horizon. "You do not understand. It is not only about owing, it is about honor. About walking a path together once it has begun. I cannot turn from it, not because I must, but because I choose." Her words stayed with him, and Luke felt something stir in his heart, a feeling he had not expected. Not when he first offered water to a starving girl in the desert. It was more than duty, more than tradition. It was the beginning of trust, of loyalty, of something he dared not name yet. And as the night fell around them, Luke realized that his life, once quiet and lonely, had been forever changed. The days grew longer and spring turned slowly into summer. The ranch seemed more alive than it had ever been. Luke noticed how different it felt to wake each morning with the smell of warm bread on the fire or the sound of Leia's laughter outside. Once his mornings had been silent, filled only with the lowing of cattle and the creak of wooden boards under his boots. Now there was warmth, not just from the fire, but from the presence of others who shared the work and the quiet moments with him. But life outside the ranch was not as peaceful. The people in town still carried their doubts and fears. Each time Luke rode in for supplies, he heard mutters behind his back, saw the suspicious looks, and felt the weight of unspoken judgment. Some of the townsfolk, hardened by years of conflict with tribes, could not accept that he had opened his home to an Apache woman and her child. A few were bold enough to say it aloud. One afternoon when Luke stopped at the blacksmith's, two men leaned against the fence nearby. They whispered just loud enough for him to hear. "Man's lost his senses," one said. "Bringing her into his home, letting her raise her child there. It'll only bring trouble." "Mark my words," the other replied, spitting into the dust. "One day he'll regret it. Them people don't belong with us." Luke clenched his fists but held his tongue. He could have shouted at them, but he knew words would not change hardened hearts. Instead, he finished his errand quickly and returned home. Yet when he rode across the open land back to his ranch, anger burned inside him. That evening, as the sun set, Ayanna was outside tending to the small garden she had started near the cabin. She noticed his expression before he spoke a word. "They said something to you again," she said quietly. Luke exhaled slowly. "They'll never understand. Doesn't matter how much you've done here. They've already decided who you are." Ayanna brushed soil from her hands and looked toward the horizon. "Their words cannot change the truth. The earth does not care what men say. The wind still blows, the sun still rises. We keep living." Her calmness unsettled and comforted him at the same time. She had faced far worse than gossip, he realized. And yet, she still stood tall. That night, after Leia had fallen asleep, Luke and Ayanna sat by the fire. The silence stretched, broken only by the crackling of wood. Finally, Luke spoke. "Do you ever regret it? The bond you say ties you to me." Ayanna turned her eyes to him, the firelight flickering in their dark depths. "Regret? No. My life was broken before you found us. My daughter was weak, close to death. You gave her food, water, and life. To us, that gift is greater than gold. If I walk beside you, it is because the path feels right. I do not regret." Luke felt something stir inside him, a mix of admiration and something deeper, something he had tried not to name. He cleared his throat. "I never thought I'd say this, but I don't feel alone anymore. For years I thought being alone was easier. But now, I don't want to go back to that." Ayanna studied him for a long moment. Then she spoke softly, her voice carrying both sorrow and strength. "I lost my husband years ago. He was strong, but he was taken by conflict between our people and yours. I never thought I would trust another man. Yet here I am in your home, sharing your fire. Life is strange." Their eyes met across the fire, and for a moment neither spoke. In that silence, Luke realized that the bond between them had grown beyond tradition. It was no longer only about duty or honor. It was about trust, about shared struggles, and the quiet understanding that had formed between them. The bond grew stronger in small ways. Luke noticed how Ayanna's hand lingered on the table a little longer when she passed him a cup. He noticed how her laughter, rare but genuine, made the room brighter. Leia began to call him Papa Luke more often, and each time, the word felt less like a child's game and more like a truth settling into place. One afternoon, Luke worked with the cattle in the corral while Ayanna watched from the fence. Leia perched beside her, swinging her legs happily. Luke wiped sweat from his brow and smiled at them. For a moment, it felt like something out of a dream he had never dared to dream. A home, a family, laughter on the air, but reality pressed in. Some of the ranchers from town came by under the excuse of checking fences. They looked at Ayanna with sharp eyes, their words polite but edged with disapproval. Luke stood firm, making it clear that Ayanna and Leia belonged here. Still, he felt the distance between himself and his neighbors grow wider with every passing day. That night, he confessed his worry to Ayanna. "They want me to send you away. They think I'm a fool for keeping you here. If things get worse, they might try to force it." Ayanna's gaze was calm, but her words were firm. "And what do you want, Luke?" The question hit him harder than he expected. He thought for a long moment before answering. "I want you to stay. Both of you. This place, it's different with you here. Better." For the first time, Ayanna smiled fully. Not the small curve of lips she sometimes allowed, but a smile that reached her eyes. "Then it does not matter what they want. It matters what you want. What we build here is ours, not theirs." The weeks rolled on and the bond deepened. Ayanna shared more stories of her people, tales of the earth and sky, of spirits that lived in the mountains and rivers. Luke listened with fascination, realizing how much wisdom she carried. He in turn told her about his parents, about how they had worked the land until their last days. He spoke of the loneliness that had followed, and how he had thought it would never end. One evening, as the sky turned red with sunset, Leia ran across the yard holding a small wildflower. She placed it in Luke's hand and said proudly, "Papa Luke, this is for you." He looked at the flower, then at the child's bright face, and his chest tightened with a warmth he had never known. Ayanna watched, her eyes shining with quiet emotion. That night, after Leia had gone to bed, Luke finally said the words he had been holding back. "Ayanna, this bond, I don't see it as something forced on us anymore. I see it as something I want. If tradition says you belong to me, then I want it to be more than that. I want you to know I belong to you too." The firelight flickered between them and Ayanna's breath caught softly. She looked at him, her eyes glistening with something unspoken. For a long moment, silence filled the room, heavy but full of meaning. Then she reached across the table and placed her hand lightly on his. "You speak from your heart," she said, "and my heart hears you." It was not a declaration of love in the way Luke had heard in town songs or novels, but it was stronger, deeper, rooted in honesty and respect. And in that moment, Luke knew the bond they shared was no longer just about tradition or duty. It was about choice, about a new life that they were building together, no matter what others thought. The summer sun had grown harsh and the air carried the smell of dust and dry grass. Life at the ranch had settled into a rhythm. Mornings spent tending cattle, afternoons working fences or in the small garden, evenings around the fire with laughter and quiet conversation. Luke had grown used to seeing Ayanna move gracefully about the place, her presence as natural as the wind across the plains. Leia had become like his own daughter, her small hands always reaching for his, her bright eyes filling the ranch with joy. But peace never lasted long in that land. The raiders who had struck before had not been defeated, only delayed. Word spread of them attacking another ranch, taking horses and supplies. Fear hung over the settlement and suspicion pointed again toward native tribes, though Luke knew well it was nothing more than outlaws using fear to cover their crimes. One evening, as the sky darkened, Luke heard a noise from the pasture. He stepped outside and saw the cattle restless, their shapes shifting nervously in the dim light. His heart tightened. He knew this feeling. Danger was near. Before he could reach the barn, shadows moved at the edge of the corral. At least half a dozen raiders slipped through the darkness, armed with rifles and knives, their voices low and harsh. Luke raised his rifle, shouting, "Get away from here!" The men laughed, not afraid this time. Shots rang out and the cattle panicked, crashing against the fences. Luke ducked behind a post, firing back. Ayanna appeared beside him, not with a weapon, but with a plan already in her sharp eyes. "They are many," she said quickly, "but the land can fight with us. Come." She led him around the corral, moving swiftly despite the danger. She pointed out the dry ditch that curved behind the barn. "Drive them this way. The ground is loose, they will stumble." Luke trusted her without question. He fired 2 quick shots, drawing the raiders' attention. As they moved toward him, Ayanna gave a sharp whistle, startling the cattle into a stampede. The herd charged toward the ditch, forcing the raiders into confusion. Dust filled the air, hooves thundered, and shouts echoed in the night. One raider tripped and fell hard, another was nearly trampled. The rest stumbled in the chaos, coughing and cursing. Luke advanced, firing again, his steady aim keeping them from regaining control. Ayanna moved like the desert wind, throwing stones to distract, guiding the herd with sharp cries, turning confusion into their weapon. In the end, the raiders broke. They grabbed their wounded and fled into the darkness, leaving behind their threat. The cattle slowly settled, though their breathing remained harsh. Luke lowered his rifle, his chest heaving. Ayanna stood beside him, her face calm though her eyes burned with fierce light. "It is done," she said simply. Luke looked at her, his respect deeper than ever. "No," he said. "It's not just done. You saved this ranch. You saved me." By morning, news of the raid had reached town. Some came to see the damage, expecting to find Luke defeated. Instead, they found his herd safe and his home unbroken. When he told them how Ayanna had helped turn the raiders away, some scoffed, unwilling to believe. But others, seeing the truth in his eyes and the strength in hers, began to question their prejudice. One older rancher, who had long avoided Luke since Ayanna arrived, finally tipped his hat to her. "Guess we misjudged," he admitted gruffly. "Seems you've got more courage than most of us." It was not acceptance from all, but it was a beginning. As days passed, the ranch grew steadier. Neighbors who had once muttered against Luke now came quietly to ask advice or to borrow tools, their eyes darting toward Ayanna with a mixture of respect and lingering caution. Change was slow, but it was there. One evening, as the sun set golden across the land, Luke sat on the porch with Ayanna and Leia. The little girl curled against his side, humming softly as she held a small doll Ayanna had made for her. The air was warm, filled with the scent of sagebrush. Luke looked at the woman beside him, her profile strong against the fading light. "When you first said you belonged to me," he began quietly, "I didn't understand. I thought it was something I couldn't accept, but now, I see it differently." Ayanna turned to him, her dark eyes calm. "And how do you see it now?" Luke smiled faintly. "Not as tradition, not as duty, but as a gift. And I want you to know, if tradition says you belong to me, then I belong to you too, not because I must, but because I choose it." For a long moment, silence hung between them. Then Ayanna reached out, her hand resting lightly over his. "Choice is stronger than tradition," she said softly. "I choose too." Leia stirred at their side, her sleepy voice cutting through the moment. "Does this mean we are a family now?" Luke's heart swelled as he pulled her close. "Yes, Leia," he said firmly. "We're a family." From that day forward, life on the ranch was no longer marked by loneliness. Luke and Ayanna worked side by side, each task done not as obligation but as partnership. They faced the land together, its challenges and its blessings. The whispers from town grew quieter, replaced little by little with respect, and even if some never accepted fully, it no longer mattered. What mattered was the bond forged not only by bread and water in the desert, but by courage, trust, and the choice to walk forward together. Luke often thought back to that first day, when he had found a starving girl and given her food and water. He had not known then that he was giving more than a meal. He was giving himself a new life, a new family, and a future he had never dared to imagine. And so, under the wide skies of the desert, with cattle grazing in the fields and laughter echoing from the cabin, the cowboy and the Apache woman built a life bound not by chains, but by love, honor, and the unbreakable strength of choosing each other.